There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in very large, very empty places. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of a quiet library, or a house at midnight. A different silence, the silence of the Mongolian steppe, where the nearest tree might be 100 miles away, where the wind arrives from so far off that you can sometimes hear it coming minutes before it touches your face, and where a person standing alone under that sky might genuinely be the only human being for as far as the eye, or even the imagination, can reach. It is into a silence like this that our story begins, not with armies, not with conquest, not yet. It begins with a single family camped somewhere along the banks of the Onon River, in a landscape so vast it seems to dissolve the idea of borders altogether. No walls, no gates, no marked edges of any kingdom. Only grass and sky and the slow movement of animals grazing toward the horizon. Somewhere in this landscape, sometime around the year 1162, a boy was born clutching something in his tiny fist. According to the stories later told about him, stories shaped by memory, by legend, and by the particular way empires like to describe the beginnings of the men who built them, he emerged holding a clot of dark blood, tight in his small hand, as though he had arrived already gripping something meant to be his. His father named him Temujin. He could not have known, and neither could anyone standing in that chair, wrapped in the smoke of a dung fire and the smell of boiled mutton and horse milk, that this infant would one day be spoken of by nearly every civilization on the Eurasian landmass, feared in Beijing, feared in Baghdad, feared in Kiev, feared in cities whose names this family had never heard and never would. For now he was simply a baby, a small, ordinary weight in his mother's arms, in a world that did not yet have any reason to notice him. But before we can understand what Temujin would become, we need to spend some time in the world that made him. Because the story of Genghis Khan is not only the story of one extraordinary man. It is the story of an entire way of life, one that shaped how he saw danger, loyalty, hunger, kinship, and survival. To understand the empire he built, we first have to understand the grass beneath his feet. So let us slow down. Let us breathe in the cold, clean air of the 13th century steppe and simply look around for a while, before anything happens at all. If you had stood on a low rise somewhere in what is now Mongolia in the year 1160, 2 years before Temujin's birth, you would have seen something almost impossible to describe to someone who had only ever lived among mountains, or forests, or coastlines. You would have seen grass to every horizon, rolling in gentle waves when the wind passed over it, silver green in summer, pale gold in autumn, buried under hard blue-white snow for the long months of winter. This was, and still is, one of the harshest inhabited environments on Earth. Summers could reach blistering heat under a merciless sun, while winters plunged to temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. There was little rainfall. There were almost no forests except in scattered pockets near rivers or in the northern taiga, where the steppe gave way to Siberia. There was no soil rich enough, in most places, to support the kind of farming that sustained the great settled civilizations to the south. China, with its rice paddies and millet fields, or the irrigated river valleys of Central Asia. And so the people who lived here had built an entire civilization around a different relationship with the land. Instead of asking the earth to stay still and grow things for them, they moved, constantly, following the rhythm of the seasons, following the grass itself, because the grass was really the thing that mattered, not for people to eat, but for their animals to eat, because their animals were, in almost every sense that counted, their entire economy. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, camels in the drier southern regions. These were not simply possessions, they were food, clothing, shelter, transportation, currency and status, all at once. A family's wealth was measured not in coins or land, but in the size and health of its herds. And because those herds needed fresh grass and fresh water and could not stay in one place too long without stripping the land bare, the people who tended them could not stay in one place either. This meant that home, for most steppe families, was not a fixed location. It was a structure, the jer, known in later centuries by the Russian-derived word yurt, a round felt tent stretched over a collapsible wooden lattice frame, capable of being taken down, packed onto a cart or the back of an animal, and rebuilt again within hours. Families might move their entire household 4 times a year, sometimes more, chasing pasture across enormous distances that would take a modern traveller days to cross by car. Picture, for a moment, what this meant for daily life. There was no permanent well outside your door, No village square you visited every morning. No ancestral house passed down through generations, standing in the same spot for 100 years. Instead, there was a landscape you came to know so intimately. Every hill, every bend in a river, every seasonal watering hole, that you could navigate it without needing anything like a map. Elders carried this knowledge in memory and passed it down through stories and direct instruction, because a wrong turn, a misjudged season, a herd led to exhausted pasture, could mean the difference between a family's survival and its slow starvation. Children born into this world were from a very young age taught to ride, not eventually, not as an accomplishment to master in adolescence. Almost as soon as they could sit upright and hold on, they were placed on the backs of gentle animals, sometimes tied in place with cloth to keep them from falling, and taught the rhythms of movement that would define the rest of their lives. By the age of 3 or 4, many steppe children could ride short distances unassisted. By 6 or 7, many could handle a small bow, shooting at targets from horseback, developing the extraordinary coordination between hand, eye, and galloping animal that would one day make Mongol cavalry one of the most feared forces in military history. This was not martial training in the way a modern person might imagine it. Young boys drilling in formation, preparing explicitly for war. It was simply survival. Riding meant you could follow the herds. Shooting meant you could hunt rabbits, marmots, birds, and on larger organized hunts, wolves and deer, driven across the plains in coordinated drives that taught entire communities how to move together, encircle prey, and communicate across distance using signals and horn calls. These communal hunts, called neige, were in a sense rehearsals, not consciously, not with any thought of future battles, but they built exactly the kind of coordinated group movement across open terrain that would later prove devastatingly effective when turned toward human enemies instead of game animals. Food on the steppe reflected this pastoral life entirely. Meat, especially mutton, formed a central part of the diet, but so did dairy in astonishing variety. Most families relied heavily on the milk of their mares, sheep, goats, and cattle, processed into yogurt, hardened curds, and a fermented, slightly alcoholic drink made from mare's milk called airag, which provided calories, hydration, and a mild intoxicating effect that made it central to hospitality and celebration alike. Grain was rare and treasured, usually obtained through trade with settled peoples to the south, since so little of the steppe could be farmed. A traveller passing through, by custom, was rarely turned away hungry. Hospitality was not simply politeness here, it was a kind of insurance policy, a mutual understanding that in a landscape this unforgiving, today's stranger might be tomorrow's rescuer, and refusing shelter to someone in need could just as easily be your own family's fate reversed. Clothing, too, was built entirely around function in a punishing climate. Thick wool and felt, layered deal robes wrapped and belted for warmth, fur linings and hats for the brutal winters. Boots designed with an upward curving toe that, historians believe, may have helped riders keep their feet secure in stirrups. Nothing was decorative without also being practical. Even embroidery and ornamentation, when they appeared, tended to signal status or clan identity as much as aesthetic taste. And clan identity mattered enormously because the political structure of the steppe was built almost entirely around kinship. There was in Temujin's early world no unified Mongol nation in the way we might imagine a country today. Instead, the vast grasslands were home to numerous tribes and confederations. Mongols, Merkits, Tatars, Karaits, Naimans, Orats and others, each with its own leadership, its own alliances, its own long and often bloody history of feuds, marriages, betrayals and shifting loyalties. Some of these groups were loosely related by language and custom. Others were rivals stretching back generations. Alliances were sealed through marriage, through oaths, through shared hardship, and broken just as often when circumstances or ambition demanded it. Leadership among these tribes was rarely inherited in a simple, stable line. A Khan, a chief or ruler, held authority partly through lineage but far more through demonstrated ability, skill in battle, generosity in distributing captured wealth and livestock, wisdom in navigating alliances, and the loyalty he could personally command from warriors who followed him not out of legal obligation, but because they judged him worth following. This meant steppe leadership was inherently unstable. A Khan who grew weak, who lost battles, who failed to reward his followers, could see his people drift away to join a stronger leader almost overnight. Power on the steppe had to be continuously earned, it was never simply held. This instability bred a particular kind of society, one where alliances were often cemented through marriage between clans, where the taking of wives sometimes occurred through raiding and could spark generations-long feuds, where a family's fortunes could rise or collapse within a single season, depending on the outcome of a raid, a harsh winter, or the death of a protector. Life expectancy was not long by modern standards. Disease, warfare, harsh winters, and the simple physical toll of this demanding existence meant that death was a familiar, near presence in a way that can be difficult for those of us living in more insulated modern circumstances to fully imagine. And yet within this hardship there was also warmth. Extended families lived closely bound together. Storytelling filled the long winter evenings inside jars heated by dung fires, tales of ancestors, of Skyfather Tengri and Mother Earth, of spirits inhabiting mountains and rivers, of heroic deeds and cautionary failures. Music, too. The haunting sound of the horsehead fiddle, the layered, resonant technique of throat singing that could imitate the sound of wind or running water. Songs passed between generations that carried both entertainment and history in their verses. Religion here was not organized in the way many settled societies understood religion, with temples and priesthoods and fixed doctrine. Instead, most steppe peoples practiced forms of shamanism, believing the world was alive with spirits, in mountains, in rivers, in the sky itself, personified as the great sky god Tengri, whose will was thought to move through the wind and the stars. Shamans, both men and women, served as intermediaries with this spirit world, called upon in times of illness, before hunts, before important decisions, to divine the will of forces beyond ordinary sight. This spiritual worldview would remain with Temujin his entire life, shaping how he understood his own rise, and how he would one day explain his conquests, not as ambition alone, but as something sanctioned, even ordained, by the sky itself. It's worth pausing here in this quiet moment before our story truly begins, to notice something important. To the great settled civilizations of the era, the Song dynasty in southern China, the Jin dynasty ruling northern China, the Khwarezmian Empire stretching across Central Asia and Persia, the Abbasid Caliphate still nominally presiding over the Islamic world from Baghdad, the nomadic peoples of the northern steppe were, for the most part, a peripheral concern, a source of occasional raids, a market for trade goods, a useful buffer sometimes in the endless calculations of regional politics. Powerful states like the Jin dynasty had, for generations, pursued deliberate strategies to keep the steppe tribes divided and fighting among themselves, understanding, correctly, as it would turn out, that a unified confederation of these mounted warriors could pose an existential threat if it ever coalesced under a single determined leader. No one, in the mid-12th century, imagined that threat was imminent. The steppe had always been fractured. Tribes had always fought each other more than they fought outsiders. This was simply how things were, how they had always been, stretching back further than anyone's grandparents could remember. But the world was about to learn otherwise. Let us return now to that small family camped along the Onon River in the years just before and just after Temujin's birth. His father was a man named Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, respected but not among the most powerful leaders of the steppe. Yesugei's own position had been built partly through his father's standing and partly through his own reputation as a capable warrior, but the Borjigin clan, at this point in history, occupied a modest place in the complicated web of steppe politics, allied with some groups, at odds with others, always navigating carefully to avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention. The story of how Yesugei came to marry Temujin's mother, a woman named Holun, is itself a story that tells us something important about the world Temujin was born into. Holun had originally been travelling with her new husband, a man from the Merkit tribe, when Yesugei and his brothers encountered them along the road. According to the accounts that have survived, most notably preserved centuries later in a chronicle called The Secret History of the Mongols, our single richest and most intimate source for Temujin's early life, Yesugei and his companions gave chase, and Holun's husband, recognizing he was outmatched and unwilling to risk his life in a hopeless fight, fled to save himself, leaving his new bride behind to be taken by Yesugei as his own wife. It's worth sitting with this moment for a while, uncomfortable as it is, because it was not treated as unusual within the world it occurred in. Marriage by capture, though certainly not universal, was a recognized, if not universally admired, practice among steppe peoples of this era, and it created exactly the kind of long-simmering resentments that would echo forward through Temujin's own life, in ways none of them could have predicted. The Merkits did not forget. Grievances like this one were remembered, sometimes for generations, waiting for circumstances to shift before old debts came due. Ho Lun, for her part, appears in the historical record as a woman of remarkable strength and resilience, qualities she would need in overwhelming abundance in the years ahead. She would go on to raise several children largely on her own after tragedy struck her family, and the values she instilled in her eldest son, caution balanced with ambition, a sharp read of loyalty and betrayal, an unwillingness to simply accept the position fate seemed to have assigned him, would shape the man he eventually became. Temujin, according to tradition, was named after a Tatar chieftain his father had recently defeated in battle, a way of marking the child's birth with a moment of paternal triumph, though it also meant the boy carried, quite literally, the name of an enemy his family had made through violence. The years of Temujin's early childhood, though scarce in surviving detail, appear to have followed the normal rhythms of steppe life we've already described. Learning to ride, learning to survive the seasons, absorbing the complicated web of alliances and rivalries that defined his family's position in the world. One event from this period, however, has been preserved with particular care in the historical memory, because it set in motion much of what followed. When Temujin was around 9 years old, his father decided it was time to arrange a marriage for him, a common practice, meant to secure useful alliances early. Yesugei travelled with his son to the territory of Holun's own people, the Ongarat tribe, known among the steppe peoples for the beauty of their daughters and their preference for peaceful alliance building through marriage rather than raiding. There, Yesugei met a family with a young daughter named Botte, close to Temujin's own age, and the two fathers agreed to a betrothal. Following custom, Temujin was left behind to live with Botte's family for a time, a practice meant to let the young groom become familiar with his future wife's household and prove himself useful and trustworthy before the marriage was formalized. It was on his journey home alone that Yesugei's fortunes took a devastating turn. Passing through Tatar territory, the same people his family had clashed with before, the same people whose defeated chieftain had given Temujin his very name, Yesugei stopped, following steppe custom of hospitality, even toward potential rivals, to share a meal with a group of Tatars he encountered along the way. According to the secret history, they recognized him, and though custom obligated them to extend hospitality regardless of old grievances, they took a different kind of revenge, poisoning his food. Yesugei did not die immediately. He managed to travel on, growing weaker, and reached his own camp before the poison finally overcame him. Realizing what was happening, he asked that someone be sent to retrieve his young son from Botte's family before it was too late. Temujin returned home to find his father dying, and within a short time, dead altogether. He was somewhere around 9 or 10 years old. What followed was, by any measure, one of the most precarious periods of his life, a period that would leave permanent marks on his character, his worldview, and the ruthless pragmatism that would later define his rule. In steppe society, a chieftain's authority was never simply inherited by his children, the way a crown might pass in a European kingdom. It had to be actively held, actively defended, actively earned through the loyalty of the men who chose to follow him. And a dead chieftain's young son, with no military reputation of his own, no proven ability to lead raids, protect followers, or distribute wealth, held almost no claim on that loyalty at all. The clan that had followed Yesugei made a hard, cold calculation. Rather than continue supporting his widow and young children, most of them abandoned the family, taking their herds, their followers, and their protection elsewhere, leaving Holun with her children, Temujin, his brothers Kasar, Hachiun and Temuj, his sister Temulun, and 2 half-brothers, Beta and Belgute, sons of Yesugei by another wife, essentially destitute, stripped of the herds and status that had defined their position, left to survive largely on their own in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It is difficult to overstate how dangerous this situation was. Without herds, without the protection of a strong clan network, without the resources that made survival on the steppe possible, this family faced a very real prospect of simply not making it through the coming seasons. And this is precisely the period in which the historical record, filtered as always through later retelling, legend, and the particular narrative needs of an empire explaining the greatness of its founder, describes Temujin's family surviving on forage roots, wild onions, fish caught from rivers, small game hunted with whatever weapons they could manage, and the sheer determined labour of Holon herself, who is remembered as holding her fractured family together through a combination of fierce will and practical resourcefulness. It was during this desperate period, according to the secret history of the Mongols, that an incident occurred which historians and biographers have returned to again and again as a window into Temujin's emerging character, troubling, revealing, and impossible to fully soften with the passage of time. Tension had been building between Temujin and his half-brother Beta, apparently over questions of resources, status, and perhaps leadership within the fractured remnant of their family. Questions of exactly the kind that mattered enormously when survival itself was at stake, and every fish caught, every bird brought down with an arrow, represented calories that could mean the difference between a family making it through winter or not. According to the account, a dispute arose after Beta took food, by some versions of fish, by others game the younger boys had caught, that Temujin and his full brother Kassar felt belonged to them. Rather than resolve this through argument alone, Temujin and Kassar are said to have ambushed and killed Beta. Holon's reaction, as preserved in the chronicle, was one of anguished fury, comparing her sons in that moment to wild animals turning on their own, warning them that in destroying one of their own limited number of protectors, at a time when they had almost no allies left in the world, they had done something that could only weaken an already desperately vulnerable family. We should treat this story with the same historical caution we bring to all elements of Temujin's early life, since our primary source was compiled generations after the events it describes, shaped by oral tradition and, quite possibly, by the narrative purposes of explaining and even justifying the character of the man this boy became. But most historians who have studied this period take the episode seriously as reflecting something real and important. Not necessarily every precise detail, but the underlying truth it points toward. That Temujin grew up in conditions so precarious, so stripped of the normal protections and hierarchies that ordinarily govern steppe life, that he learned very young to view loyalty, resources, and threats to his family's survival with an intensity, and at times a ruthlessness, that would remain with him for the rest of his life. This was not a childhood of gentle lessons learned in safety. It was a childhood that taught, again and again, that the world did not owe him protection, that alliances could dissolve overnight, that even those closest to you might, under sufficient pressure, become rivals rather than allies, and that survival sometimes demanded choices no child should have had to make. The years following Beta's death remain sparsely documented, but the broader trajectory is clear enough. The family continued to struggle at the margins of steppe society, vulnerable to precisely the kind of predation that a family without strong protectors inevitably attracted. At some point during this period, Temujin himself was captured by a rival clan. Accounts suggest this may have been connected to older grievances involving his father, or simply an opportunistic move against a family known to be defenseless. He was taken prisoner and, according to the surviving accounts, held in a wooden kang, a heavy portable restraint locked around the neck and sometimes wrists, designed to prevent escape while still allowing a prisoner to be moved from place to place, a humiliating and physically exhausting device that would have made even basic tasks like eating and sleeping difficult. The story of his escape has become one of the most repeated episodes of his early legend. Accounts describe him managing, during a festival or a moment of reduced vigilance among his captors, to strike one of them with the heavy wooden restraint still locked around his neck, and flee into the darkness. He is said to have hidden in a river, submerged with only his face above the waterline, while search parties passed nearby saved, in one version of the story, by a member of a rival family who noticed him but chose, for reasons the sources don't fully explain, not to reveal his hiding place, instead quietly advising him where to flee once the immediate danger passed. Whatever the precise details, and given how many decades separated these events from their eventual written recording, some poetic shaping is almost certainly present. The core of the story reflects something historians generally accept as broadly true, that Temujin's youth involved genuine danger, genuine captivity, and a demonstrated capacity even as a young person to survive circumstances that would have destroyed many others. Slowly, gradually, across years that the historical record renders only in fragments and impressions, rather than a clear connected narrative, Temujin began rebuilding. He reconnected with the family of his betrothed, Borte, and the marriage that had been arranged in his childhood was finally carried out. A union that would prove to be one of the most important and enduring relationships of his entire life. Borte would become not simply his wife, but a trusted advisor, a political partner whose counsel he sought and valued even after he had taken other wives, as was customary for a man of growing status, and the mother of the sons who would eventually inherit different portions of the empire he built. It was also around this period that Temujin began cultivating relationships that would prove essential to his eventual rise. Alliances built not on inherited status, since he had almost none left to draw on, but on personal loyalty, demonstrated trustworthiness, and mutual benefit. Chief among these early relationships was his bond with a man named Jamuka, a chieftain from a related clan whom Temujin had known since childhood. The two young men performed a ritual known as becoming Anda, sworn brothers, bound by oath in a ceremony steppe custom regarded as creating a bond even deeper, in some respects, than blood kinship itself. They exchanged gifts, pledged loyalty, and for a period of years, their fortunes rose together, their combined followers strengthening both men's positions in the complicated, shifting landscape of steppe alliances. We will return to Jamuka, because the story of his relationship with Temujin, beginning in devoted brotherhood and ending in one of the most consequential ruptures in steppe history, is central to understanding how Temujin eventually rose from a vulnerable, dispossessed young man to the leader capable of uniting the fractured tribes of the steppe under a single banner for the first time in generations. But before that rupture, there was another test, one that struck at the heart of Temujin's minute family and revealed, in the crucible of crisis, both his growing capability as a leader and the depth of loyalty he could inspire in others. Not long after his marriage to Borte, a raiding party from the Merkit tribe attacked the camp where Temujin's family was staying. This was, in a real sense, old business finally coming due. The same Merkit people whose kinsman had lost his bride, Holun, to Yesugei's ambush decades earlier. Grievances on the steppe, as we've already noted, did not simply fade with time. They waited. In the chaos of the attack, Temujin managed to flee with his mother, brothers, and half-brother to safety in nearby mountainous terrain. Terrain difficult enough that mounted raiders would struggle to pursue effectively. But Borte, in the desperate scramble to escape, was left behind and captured by the Merkits, taken as a captive bride in what amounted to a direct, generations-delayed act of retribution for the wrong done to Holun. For Temujin, this was a moment of profound crisis, and also, in retrospect, a critical turning point in his development as a leader. He could not simply rely on his own limited resources to rescue his wife. His personal following at this point remained small, nowhere near sufficient to challenge the Merkits directly. Instead, he turned to two relationships that would prove decisive: his sworn brother Jamuka and a powerful steppe leader named Togrul, Khan of the Kherate Confederation, who had once been a close ally of Temujin's late father, bound by their own oath of Anda decades earlier. That Temujin could call upon this old relationship, one formed between his father and Togrul, inherited now by a young man with almost nothing to offer in return except the memory of that old bond and the promise of future loyalty, speaks to how seriously such oaths were regarded in steppe culture, and also to Temujin's own emerging political instinct, an understanding, even at this relatively early stage of his life, that alliances built on genuine mutual obligation could accomplish what raw personal strength alone could not. Togrul agreed to help, bringing his own considerable military resources to the cause, and Jamuka likewise mobilized his followers. The combined force that resulted was far larger and more capable than anything Temujin could have assembled alone, and it succeeded in tracking down the Merkit camp, launching a surprise attack that scattered the Merkit forces and allowed Temujin to recover Borte. This episode, though centered on the intensely personal crisis of a young husband's wife being taken from him, carried consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate rescue. It demonstrated to the wider steppe world that Temujin, despite his fractured, dispossessed beginnings, could successfully call upon powerful allies and organize effective, coordinated military action. It deepened his relationship with Togrul, positioning the older Khan as something of a patron and protector for the rising young leader. And it marked the high point of his brotherhood with Jamuka, the two young men fighting side by side, their combined followers living and travelling together for a period afterward in what the sources describe as close, genuine companionship. There is one more detail from this episode worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because it touches on something the story rarely resolves with complete comfort. Borte, when recovered, was already pregnant, and the timing meant it was not entirely certain whether the child she carried had been conceived before her capture, with Temujin, or during her time among the Merkits. The son born from this pregnancy, named Jochi, a name that itself carries a meaning close to guest, would grow up fully accepted as Temujin's son and would go on to a position of real importance in the empire his father built. But the question of his parentage would surface again, decades later, at a moment of real consequence, in ways we'll return to when the story reaches that point. For now, it's enough to know that Temujin, whatever private uncertainty he may have carried, treated Jochi as his own from the beginning, and Borte remained, throughout the rest of her long life, his first and most trusted wife. For a time after Borte's rescue, Temujin and Jamuka's combined camps lived and moved together, their friendship at what the sources describe as its warmest point. But steppe partnerships of this kind, built on mutual benefit and personal loyalty rather than institutional structure, tended to be inherently unstable the moment underlying interests began to diverge, and this is precisely what began to happen as both men's followings grew. The precise cause of the eventual rupture between Temujin and Jamuka remains somewhat obscure in the historical sources, described in the secret history through an enigmatic exchange about where their combined camp should move to next. Jamuka suggesting one location favourable to shepherds, Temujin, after consulting quietly with his mother and wife, deciding instead to move his own followers away during the night, without a direct confrontation. It's a strange, almost cryptic episode as preserved in the sources, and historians have long debated what it really represented, perhaps growing tension over leadership styles, perhaps rival ambitions neither man was yet ready to voice openly, perhaps simply an accumulation of smaller frictions that had made continued close partnership untenable. Whatever the precise cause, the departure marked a genuine turning point. A significant number of followers chose, in the aftermath, to leave Jamuka's camp and join Temujin instead, a meaningful vote of confidence from steppe families who, in choosing which leader to follow, were making calculated decisions about who offered the better prospects for protection, provision, and future success. Among those who threw in their lot with Temujin during this period were men who would go on to become some of his most important generals and closest advisors throughout the rest of his life. Figures like Borchu and Jelma, whose loyalty, once given, would remain unwavering across decades of subsequent warfare and conquest. It was around this period, with his following now substantially grown, that Temujin began to be recognized with greater formal status. Sources describe him eventually being proclaimed Khan by his own followers, not yet Khan of a unified Mongol nation, since no such unified nation yet existed, but leader of his own growing confederation of followers, drawn from multiple clans who had chosen, for their own varied reasons, to place their trust and their survival in his hands. This growing status did not go unnoticed by the wider steppe world, and it set in motion the long, complicated sequence of conflicts, alliances, betrayals, and battles that would, across the following 2 decades, gradually consolidate power in Temujin's hands, and eventually lead to something the fractured steppe tribes had not seen in generations, if ever, genuine, lasting unification under a single leader. Let's pause here, in this quiet middle distance of the story, and take a moment to notice what kind of leader was emerging from all of this difficult, formative experience. Temujin's childhood had taught him, through direct and often brutal necessity, that survival on the steppe depended on more than martial skill alone. It depended on the ability to read shifting loyalties accurately, to build genuine trust with followers who had every reason to abandon a weak leader for a stronger one, to reward loyalty generously enough that it was worth maintaining even when circumstances grew difficult, and to recognize threats, even from within one's own family, before they could prove fatal. He had experienced, in the most visceral possible terms, what it meant to be powerless, a fatherless boy whose own clan had abandoned his family to likely death, a captive locked in a wooden restraint, a young husband unable to protect his own wife from raiders. And he seems to have carried these experiences forward, not as simple grievances to be avenged, though there was certainly some of that too, but as lessons about the fundamental instability of power on the steppe, lessons that would eventually inform one of his most significant and lasting innovations as a ruler, the deliberate construction of a political and military system where loyalty was owed not to inherited clan status, but to demonstrated ability and personal bonds of trust that cut across traditional tribal lines. This was, in its way, a genuinely radical idea for the world he had been born into. The steppe had, for as long as anyone could remember, organized itself around kinship, around the assumption that loyalty flowed naturally along bloodlines and clan affiliations, and that a man's status was substantially determined by the family and tribe he happened to be born into. Temujin, who had personally experienced how quickly clan loyalty could evaporate when it was convenient, and who had personally benefited from followers who chose to join him not because of inherited obligation, but because they judged him worth following, would eventually build something different, a system where a shepherd's son with proven loyalty and ability could rise to command thousands, while a chieftain's son who proved weak or treacherous could be cast aside without hesitation. We are not there yet in our story. That system, and the empire it would eventually help sustain, still lay years in the future, built gradually through the alliances, conflicts, and hard lessons of the years ahead. But the seeds of it, the particular combination of ruthless pragmatism and genuine capacity to inspire fierce personal loyalty, were already visible in this young leader, gathering followers on the grasslands along the Onon and Kurlan rivers. Still years away from the title history would remember him by, still, in these years, simply Temujin, a man rebuilding what circumstance had taken from him, one alliance, one battle, one hard decision at a time. The steppe that Temujin was gradually rising within remained, throughout these years, a genuinely dangerous and unpredictable political landscape, one where today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy, and where the balance of power among the major confederations shifted continually according to marriages, betrayals, deaths, and the ever-present calculations of self-interest that governed relations between groups who shared language and culture but rarely shared unified purpose. At this point in our story, several major powers dominated the steppe and its borderlands. The Kerik Confederation, led by Togrul, Temujin's father's old sworn brother, and now Temujin's own patron and ally, controlled substantial territory and represented one of the more organized, powerful steppe polities of the era, with Togrul himself holding the Chinese-derived title Wang Khan or Prince Khan, reflecting recognition granted to him by the Jin dynasty to the south for services rendered in suppressing rival steppe groups. The Naiman Confederation, to the west, represented another significant power, more influenced by Central Asian and even Nestorian Christian cultural currents than some of the more easterly steppe groups. The Tatars, old enemies of Temujin's family, remained a significant presence to the east and continued to enjoy a complicated relationship with the Jin dynasty, sometimes serving as the Jin's proxy enforcers against other steppe groups, in keeping with the broader Jin strategy of keeping the northern tribes divided and weak. And Temujin's former sworn brother, Jamuka, having built his own substantial following in the years since their parting, represented an increasingly significant rival power in his own right, a man who, unlike Temujin, could claim more traditional aristocratic lineage, and who commanded the loyalty of numerous clans still committed to the older, kinship-based model of steppe leadership. The years that followed Temujin's rise to recognized kinship within his own confederation were marked by a long, complicated sequence of campaigns, alliances, and shifting loyalties, in which Temujin gradually expanded his power, sometimes through direct military victory, sometimes through the careful cultivation of loyalty among defeated groups rather than their destruction, and sometimes through the outright elimination of rivals whose continued existence posed too great a threat to be tolerated. One of the earliest and most consequential of these episodes involved a joint campaign undertaken alongside Togrul and at the request of the Jin dynasty itself Against the Tatars, the old enemies whose poisoning of Temujin's father decades earlier had set his family's tragic decline into motion, the Jin, following their long-standing policy of playing steppe factions against one another, had grown concerned about the Tatars' growing independence and welcomed the opportunity to see them weakened by rival steppe forces. For Temujin, the campaign offered both the practical benefits of Jin recognition and reward, and something more personal, an opportunity, at last, to settle accounts with the people who had killed his father. The campaign proved successful, and its aftermath revealed something important about the evolving nature of Temujin's leadership and the increasingly high stakes of steppe warfare during this period. According to the sources, Temujin ordered the execution of Tatar men taller than a certain height, a brutal measure intended to eliminate the Tatars' capacity for future resistance by removing essentially the entire adult, male population capable of bearing arms, while sparing children to be absorbed, along with Tatar women, into the ranks of the victorious confederation. This kind of calculated, severe treatment of defeated enemies, determined not simply by anger or bloodlust, but by cold assessment of what was necessary to permanently neutralize a threat and productively absorb the survivors into his own growing power base, would become an increasingly recognizable pattern in Temujin's approach to conflict throughout the rest of his career, and it's worth pausing to sit with the discomfort of it honestly, rather than softening it, because it represents something genuinely important about how the empire that followed came to be built. Through the combination of genuine strategic brilliance, a real capacity to inspire loyalty and integrate defeated peoples when it served his purposes, and, when circumstances seemed to demand it, a ruthlessness that could be extraordinarily severe by almost any standard, ancient or modern. We will encounter this pattern again and again as our story continues. Cities and peoples who resisted him meeting devastating consequences, while those who submitted without prolonged resistance were often treated with comparative leniency, incorporated into his growing system rather than destroyed. It was, in its own dark way, a coherent and consistently applied logic, one that Temujin seems to have understood clearly conveyed a message to future potential enemies. Resistance carried catastrophic costs, while submission, however unwelcome, offered a path to survival and even prosperity within his expanding order. As Temujin's power and reputation grew throughout these years, tension with his former sworn brother Jamuka deepened correspondingly, eventually erupting into open conflict. The precise sequence of events that led to full-scale war between the two former brothers is recorded with some variation across different sources, but the general trajectory is clear. As both men's followings grew, and as the steppe's traditional aristocratic families increasingly rallied around Jamuka as a champion of more conventional, kinship-based leadership against Temujin's unconventional rise, the two men found themselves leading opposing coalitions in a conflict that would prove decisive for the future shape of steppe politics. The war between Temujin and Jamuka unfolded across several years and multiple engagements, with fortunes shifting between the two sides at different points. At times, Temujin suffered serious setbacks, including at least one significant battle in which his forces were decisively defeated by Jamuka's coalition. A reminder, important to hold on to as our story continues, that Temujin's eventual triumph was never simply inevitable or preordained. He experienced genuine failure, genuine near-catastrophic reversals, and had to rebuild his position more than once through skill, patience, and the continued loyalty of the followers who had chosen to remain with him even through difficult periods. Gradually, however, the balance shifted decisively in Temujin's favour, aided significantly by his continued alliance with Togrul's Kherate Confederation, and by his own evident skill in building lasting loyalty among a growing coalition of followers who increasingly saw him as offering the most viable path towards stability and prosperity in an otherwise chaotic and dangerous political landscape. The war against Jamuka eventually reached its climax with the near-total collapse of Jamuka's coalition, as defection after defection eroded his support and left him with a rapidly shrinking circle of loyal followers. It's worth noting here that even as his coalition crumbled, sources describe several of Jamuka's own remaining supporters ultimately betraying him directly to Temujin, apparently hoping this final act of loyalty breaking would earn them favour with the victorious Khan. Temujin's response to these betrayers, according to the sources, was severe. He ordered them executed, on the stated grounds that men willing to betray their own leader, even to him, could never be trusted to remain loyal in the future. This episode reveals something important and consistent about Temujin's evolving political philosophy. Whatever ruthlessness he was capable of toward defeated enemies, he placed enormous, almost singular value on loyalty itself as a principle, rewarding it generously wherever he found it, even, on occasion, in enemies who had fought against him fiercely but honorably, while treating betrayal, even betrayal that directly benefited him, as fundamentally intolerable. Jamuka himself, according to the traditional account, was eventually captured, brought before his former sworn brother, and, in one of the more emotionally resonant episodes preserved in the secret history, is described as requesting execution rather than continued life stripped of his former status and freedom, invoking the old bond of their childhood brotherhood even as he acknowledged its final tragic end. Temujin, the sources suggest, granted this request, and Jamuka was executed in a manner reportedly intended to avoid the shedding of blood, a form of death regarded in steppe custom as more honorable, reserved for those of noble status. Whatever the precise historical accuracy of this particular emotional framing, and we should remember that the secret history was compiled generations after these events, almost certainly shaped to present a coherent and meaningful narrative arc, rather than a strictly documentary record. The broader outcome is not in serious dispute among historians. With Jamuka's defeat, one of the last major rival claimants to unified steppe leadership had been eliminated, clearing a crucial obstacle from Temujin's path toward the consolidation of power that lay ahead. It is worth pausing again here, in this quieter stretch of our story, to simply sit with the strange, layered nature of this history, a history preserved for us largely through a single remarkable source, the secret history of the Mongols, itself a fascinating artifact worth understanding a little better before we continue. Composed sometime in the decades following Temujin's death, in a form of written Mongolian using an alphabet the Mongols had only recently adopted, this chronicle represents an extraordinary blend of oral history, court record, legend and origin myth, compiled, historians believe, for an internal Mongol audience rather than for outside consumption, which lends it a particular kind of candor and intimacy, not always found in histories written explicitly to celebrate or justify a ruler's reign for external or propagandistic purposes. It includes moments of genuine emotional vulnerability, family conflict, failure, and uncertainty alongside its accounts of triumph, giving us a portrait of Temujin considerably more textured and human than a simple triumphant conqueror's narrative might have offered. And yet, as with any historical source of this kind, we must hold it with appropriate care. It was compiled generations after many of the events it describes, filtered through the memories and narrative purposes of the storytellers and scribes who shaped it, and it reflects, inevitably, the particular perspective of a text meant to explain, and in some sense justify the rise of the family and empire it centers on. Alongside the secret history, historians draw on external sources as well: Chinese dynastic records, Persian chronicles written by scholars like Atta Malik Juvaini and Rashid al-Din, who had access to Mongol court records and oral traditions in the decades following the conquests, and the observations of travelers and envoys who passed through Mongol territories in the years after Temujin's death. Together, these sources allow historians to construct a reasonably confident picture of the broad trajectory of events, even while many specific details, motivations, and exact chronologies remain genuinely uncertain or actively debated among specialists. This matters for how we understand the story we're telling tonight. We are not reciting simple, uncontested fact. We are following the best reconstruction available to careful historians, working from imperfect and sometimes contradictory sources, about a life that unfolded more than 8 centuries ago, in a culture that recorded its own history very differently from the literate document-heavy civilizations to its south. Where the sources agree, we can speak with reasonable confidence. Where they diverge, or where legend has clearly shaped the telling, it's worth holding the story a little more loosely, appreciating it as much for what it reveals about how the Mongols themselves came to understand and explain their extraordinary founder as for its precise documentary accuracy. With Jamuka's defeat, Temujin's position as the preeminent power among the eastern steppe tribes was increasingly secure. But his path toward full unification of the steppe was not yet complete, and one relationship in particular, his long alliance with Togrul, Khan of the Karaite Confederation, was about to undergo its own dramatic and consequential transformation. For years, Togrul had served as something between patron, ally, and adoptive father figure to Temujin. Their relationship rooted in Togrul's old sworn brotherhood with Temujin's own father, and reinforced through years of mutual military cooperation and support. But as Temujin's own power grew, and as his forces increasingly proved themselves capable of operating independently and successfully, the balance of this relationship inevitably began to shift, creating exactly the kind of tension that so often destabilized steppe alliances once the original balance of dependency that had created them no longer reflected reality. Matters were complicated further by the influence of Togrul's own son, Sengum, who appears in the sources as viewing Temujin's rising power and influence with considerable anxiety and resentment, concerned, reasonably enough from his own perspective, that his father's growing reliance on and favour toward this increasingly powerful adopted ally might come to threaten his own eventual inheritance of Karaite leadership. Tensions escalated through a series of episodes involving failed marriage negotiations intended to further bind the two families together, growing mutual suspicion, and eventually, according to the traditional account, a plot by Sengum and his allies to eliminate Temujin through treachery, framed outwardly as an invitation to a celebratory feast that was in fact intended as an ambush. Temujin, warned in time, according to some versions of the story, by herdsmen loyal to him who overheard the plot being discussed, in other versions through more direct intelligence gathered by his own increasingly sophisticated network of informants and allies, narrowly avoided the trap, but the damage to his relationship with Togrul and the Karaite was by this point irreparable. What followed was open warfare between former allies, a conflict that proved to be one of the most difficult and dangerous of Temujin's entire career. At one particularly desperate point during this conflict, following a serious defeat, Temujin is described in the sources as having been reduced to a small remaining band of followers, forced to retreat to a muddy lake called Baljuna, where, according to tradition, he and his remaining loyal companions swore an oath of mutual loyalty, drinking the muddy water of the lake itself in the absence of anything better, pledging to share whatever fate awaited them together. This episode, known to later Mongol tradition as the Baljuna Covenant, would become deeply significant in the mythology the empire built around its founder, a symbol of loyalty tested and proven in the darkest circumstances, and the companions who shared that moment would be remembered and honoured throughout the rest of Temujin's reign as men who had proven their devotion when his fortunes were at their very lowest. From this low point, Temujin rebuilt once again, gathering strength, rallying followers, and eventually launching a decisive campaign against Togrul's forces that resulted in a comprehensive victory. Togrul himself, according to the accounts, fled the battlefield and was killed shortly afterward by forces belonging to another steppe group entirely, who apparently failed to recognize the fleeing man's identity and status until it was too late to reverse the fatal consequences of their encounter. An oddly anticlimactic end for a man who had played such a significant role in Temujin's own rise, killed not in the climactic battle against his former ally, but in an act of mistaken, almost accidental violence in its immediate aftermath. With the defeat of the Karaite Confederation, one of the last major independent powers standing between Temujin and effective control of the eastern and central steppe had fallen. Only the Naiman Confederation, to the west, remained as a significant organized rival power, and the campaign that followed against them would prove to be the final major conflict standing between Temujin and the unprecedented unification of virtually the entire Mongolian steppe under a single acknowledged leadership. Before we follow Temujin into this final campaign of unification, let's take a moment to step back from the sequence of battles and betrayals and simply notice the human texture of what these years must have actually felt like for the ordinary people living through them. Not the khans and generals whose names survive in the historical record, but the shepherds, the mothers, the children, the elderly, whose lives were shaped by these shifting fortunes in ways the chronicles rarely pause to describe in detail. For an ordinary family on the steppe during these turbulent decades, the rise of Temujin would have felt, from the ground level, less like a coherent historical narrative, and more like an unpredictable, often frightening series of ruptures and adjustments. A rumor might arrive that a rival confederation was moving through nearby territory, and a family would need to decide quickly whether to flee, to seek shelter with a stronger group, or to simply wait and hope the danger passed them by. News of a battle's outcome might mean an entirely new set of obligations and loyalties overnight, as a defeated group's remaining followers were absorbed into the victor's growing confederation. A process that, from the perspective of an ordinary herding family, might mean relocating to unfamiliar territory, adapting to new leadership, and rebuilding social bonds with neighbors who had until recently been strangers or even enemies. Children growing up during these decades would have absorbed, alongside their practical education in riding and survival, a keen awareness of the precariousness of political loyalty, learning, as Temujin himself had learned in his own difficult childhood, that the world could shift beneath a family's feet with startling speed, and that survival depended on reading these shifts correctly and adapting quickly. And yet, even amid this turbulence, the fundamental rhythms of steppe life continued. Herds still needed to be moved to fresh pasture with the changing seasons. Milk still needed to be processed into the dairy staples that formed such a central part of the diet. Children were still born, still needed to be fed and clothed, and taught the skills of survival, regardless of which confederation currently held power in a given stretch of grassland. Marriages were still arranged, still celebrated with feasting, and the exchange of gifts. The great sky above the steppe still turned through its seasons, indifferent to the human dramas of ambition and betrayal and conquest unfolding beneath it. This is perhaps one of the quieter but important truths worth holding on to as we continue following the more dramatic thread of Temujin's rise. History, even history as consequential as this one, is always lived by ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances through the accumulated small decisions of daily survival. Decisions about where to graze a herd, whom to trust, when to flee and when to stay, that rarely make it into the grand chronicles, but that collectively shaped the texture of life across the vast landscape where this story continues to unfold. The campaign against the Naiman Confederation, which unfolded in the early years of the 13th century, represented the final major military challenge standing between Temujin and effective unification of the steppe tribes under his leadership. The Naiman, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, represented a substantial and sophisticated power in their own right, with cultural and political connections extending towards Central Asia, and a court that had, by some accounts, absorbed elements of literacy and administrative organization not universally present among the more easterly steppe confederations. The campaign that followed was, by most historical accounts, decisively fought and decisively won by Temujin's forces, employing tactical innovations and battlefield discipline that would become increasingly recognizable hallmarks of Mongol military effectiveness in the campaigns still to come. Coordinated cavalry, maneuvers, effective use of scouts and intelligence gathering, and a level of disciplined coordination across large formations that many of the steppe's traditional, more loosely organized tribal forces struggled to match. Genghis Khan himself was killed in the fighting, and Naiman resistance, though it would continue in scattered form for some additional time, under the leadership of Genghis Khan's son Kuchlug, who fled westward and would resurface later in our story in connection with the Karakitan Khanate of Central Asia, was effectively broken as an organized independent power on the Mongolian steppe itself. With the Naiman defeat, Temujin had, over roughly 2 decades of conflict, alliance building, betrayal, and hard-won victory, accomplished something that had rarely, if ever, been achieved in the recorded history of the steppe: the unification, under a single acknowledged leadership, of virtually all the major tribal confederations of Mongolia: Mongols, Kerets, Naimans, Tatars, and numerous smaller groups, absorbed through conquest, alliance, and the patient, deliberate construction of loyalty that had characterized his rise from its earliest, most vulnerable beginnings. In the year 1206, at a great assembly known as a Kurultai, a gathering of the steppe's tribal leaders, warriors, and notable figures called to formalize major collective decisions in a manner that reflected, even amid the dramatic centralization of power now underway, the steppe's older traditions of collective consultation and legitimation. Temujin was formally proclaimed the supreme ruler of all the united Mongol and steppe peoples. It was at this assembly that he took the title by which history would come to know him, Genghis Khan, most commonly interpreted as meaning something like universal ruler or oceanic ruler, a title deliberately chosen to convey authority extending, at least in aspiration and rhetoric, without the traditional boundaries that had previously fragmented steppe political authority among competing tribal confederations. He was now somewhere in his mid-40s, a man who had survived a fatherless, dispossessed childhood, captivity, the loss of a beloved sworn brother turned rival, near catastrophic military defeats, and decades of the kind of relentless political and military maneuvering that had claimed the lives or fortunes of nearly every rival who had once stood against him. And now, for the first time in generations, quite possibly for the first time in the entire recorded history of the Mongolian steppe, a single leader held genuine, acknowledged authority over the whole of this vast landscape and its scattered, formerly fractious peoples. But if the tribes of the steppe imagined that this unification marked the culmination of Temujin's ambitions, that having finally achieved supremacy over his own people, he might now turn his attention towards simply governing and consolidating what he had built, they were about to discover otherwise. The unification of the steppe, remarkable and unprecedented as it was, would prove to be not the end of Genghis Khan's story, but merely its extraordinary beginning. Let us rest here for a while, in this moment of relative calm before the story turns outward, toward the wider world beyond the steppe that had shaped and formed the man now standing at the centre of this newly unified confederation. Picture, if you will, the scene at that great Kurultai of 1206. Thousands of steppe warriors and their families gathered together on the open grassland, gers stretching toward the horizon in every direction, the smoke of countless cooking fires rising into a clear northern sky, the sound of horses, of children playing between the tents, of elders exchanging news and old stories from clans that, until recently, had known each other primarily as rivals or outright enemies, now bound together under a single acknowledged authority. There would have been feasting, the roasted meat and fermented mare's milk that marked every significant steppe celebration, shared generously among the assembled thousands as a demonstration of the new Khan's wealth and generosity, qualities that mattered enormously in a culture where a leader's legitimacy depended so substantially on his capacity to provide for and reward those who followed him. There would have been music, the layered resonance of throat singing carrying across the assembled crowds, the sound of the horsehead fiddle weaving through the evening air as the light slowly faded from the enormous steppe sky. And somewhere in the midst of all this celebration, we might imagine Temujin himself, now formerly Genghis Khan, taking a quiet moment away from the festivities, looking out across the gathered peoples who had, through so many years of hardship and struggle, come to be his own. A man who had once been a fatherless boy foraging for wild onions to keep his family alive, who had once dwelt in a river with only his face above the waterline, hiding from captors who wished him dead, who had lost a beloved brother-in-arms to the irreconcilable pressures of steppe rivalry, now stood, however briefly, at the peak of everything the world he had been born into could offer. It would be worth imagining, too, the quieter, more private moments woven through this triumphant assembly. Holun, his mother, whose fierce resourcefulness had kept her fractured family alive through its most desperate years, now witnessing her son's transformation into the supreme ruler of the united steppe. Borte, his first wife, rescued so many years earlier from Merkit captors, now positioned as senior among the wives of the most powerful man in this vast landscape, her own counsel and political judgment, respected and sought throughout the years of struggle that had led to this moment. The loyal companions of the Baljuna covenant, who had shared muddy lake water with him during his darkest hour, now honoured among the closest advisors and commanders of his growing state. This is perhaps a good place to pause our story for tonight, here, in this moment of hard-won unity and quiet triumph, before the narrative turns toward the truly vast and consequential campaigns that would, over the following 2 decades, transform a newly unified steppe confederation into the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. The steppe Genghis Khan now ruled was, in its way, still a relatively small and insulated world, vast in physical distance, but largely disconnected from the great settled civilizations of China, Central Asia, Persia and beyond, which continued their own affairs largely unaware of or unconcerned by the dramatic transformation that had just occurred among the nomadic peoples to their north. The wind is still moving across the grass along the Onon and Kurlan rivers. The fires from the great gathering have burned down to embers. And somewhere in the quiet that follows any large celebration, in the hours when most of the camp has finally drifted towards sleep, the practical work of building something lasting out of a hard-won victory was already beginning. Because unifying the steppe, remarkable as it was, had solved one problem while immediately revealing another. Genghis Khan now commanded a vast confederation of peoples who until very recently had spent generations fighting each other. Old grievances did not simply dissolve because a Kurultai had declared a new order. Tribal identities, resentments, and rivalries were woven deeply into the fabric of steppe life, and a lesser leader might easily have found his new empire unraveling within a few short years, the old fractures reopening the moment his personal authority weakened even slightly. What Genghis Khan built instead, in the years immediately following his proclamation, was something the steppe had never quite seen before, a set of institutions and organizational principles designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of unraveling, to bind an enormously diverse population of former rivals into something more durable than a temporary alliance of convenience. Let us spend some time here, in this quieter administrative chapter of the story, because it is every bit as important to understanding what Genghis Khan actually built as the battles that came before it, even though it rarely receives the same dramatic attention in popular retellings. The first and perhaps most consequential of these reforms involved a fundamental reorganization of how Mongol society was structured for both military and civil purposes. Rather than allowing the old tribal groupings to remain the primary units of social and military organization, groupings that carried with them centuries of accumulated loyalty, grievance, and internal hierarchy that could easily undermine centralized authority, Genghis Khan restructured his people into units based on the decimal system. Groups of 10 households, called an arban, organized upward into groups of 100, 1,000, and ultimately 10,000, called a tumen. This was not simply an administrative convenience. It was a deliberate act of social engineering, one that mixed members of different tribes together within these newly created units, deliberately diluting the old tribal loyalties that had for so long fueled the steppe's endless cycles of feud and betrayal. A man's immediate obligations now ran to the leader of his arban, and upward through the chain of command to his thousands commander, and ultimately to the Khan himself, rather than to an inherited tribal chieftain whose own loyalties might, in an earlier era, have shifted unpredictably according to the old calculations of clan advantage. Leadership within this new system, moreover, was not simply inherited according to noble birth. While men of aristocratic background certainly retained real advantages, Genghis Khan made a point, consistent with the pattern we've already seen in his own early rise, of promoting men based on demonstrated loyalty and capability, rather than birth alone. Some of his most trusted and effective commanders came from decidedly humble origins, men who had proven their worth through years of loyal service rather than through inherited status, elevated to positions of real authority in a way that would have been almost unthinkable within the older tribal order. This meritocratic thread running through Genghis Khan's system deserves real emphasis because it represented a genuine departure from how power had traditionally worked across most of the settled world, and even across most of steppe history. A talented commander born into a family of modest herders could, under this new system, rise to lead 10,000 men, provided he demonstrated the loyalty and capability the Khan valued above almost everything else. This created powerful incentives for exactly the kind of fierce, personally invested loyalty that had carried Genghis Khan himself through his own difficult rise. Men who owed their elevated status directly and entirely to the Khan's favor had every reason to defend that status and the system that had granted it with everything they had. Alongside this reorganization came the creation of an elite personal guard known as the Keshig, drawn from among the sons of commanders and notable figures throughout the newly unified confederation. This guard served multiple purposes at once, as an elite fighting force personally loyal to the Khan, as a kind of training ground where the future leadership of the empire could be cultivated under close observation, and, not incidentally, as a form of hostage-taking that ensured the loyalty of powerful families throughout the Confederation, since their sons lived, quite literally, within arm's reach of the Khan's own household and authority. Genghis Khan also during this period formalized a legal and moral code known as the Yasa, though scholars continue to debate exactly how comprehensive, how written, and how uniformly applied this code actually was across the vast and growing empire, since no complete original text has survived to the present day, and our knowledge of its specific provisions comes largely through fragmentary references in later chronicles. What does seem clear is that this code, whatever its precise scope, addressed matters ranging from military discipline and the conduct of warfare to broader questions of social order, theft, adultery, the treatment of travelers and merchants, and the preservation of religious tolerance across the empire's rapidly diversifying population. This last point deserves particular attention because it represents one of the more genuinely surprising aspects of the empire Genghis Khan was building. Coming from a culture with its own animist, shamanistic spiritual traditions centered on the sky god Tengri, Genghis Khan showed a consistent, pragmatic tolerance toward the diverse religious traditions of the peoples he increasingly ruled and were bound to conquer. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others were, for the most part, permitted to continue practicing their faiths relatively undisturbed, provided their communities submitted to Mongol political authority. Religious leaders and their institutions were frequently exempted from taxation, a policy that, whether motivated by genuine spiritual open-mindedness, shrewd political calculation about the value of religious leaders as intermediaries with conquered populations, or some combination of both, stood in notable contrast to the religious persecutions that marked so much of the era's history elsewhere in the world. Trade, too, received particular attention and protection under the emerging Mongol order Genghis Khan understood, in a way that reflected both his own steppe upbringing, where trade with settled peoples for grain and manufactured goods had always been essential, and his growing political sophistication, that merchants and the trade routes they travelled represented enormously valuable assets, both as sources of revenue and as channels of information about the wider world beyond the steppe. Merchants travelling under Mongol protection could move across enormous distances with a degree of security that would have been unimaginable in the fractured, dangerous political landscape of the pre-unification steppe, and this policy would, in the decades to come, help lay the groundwork for the extraordinary flourishing of long-distance trade across Eurasia that later observers would come to call the Pax Mongolica, a Mongol peace that, whatever violence had been required to establish it, would eventually facilitate unprecedented movement of goods, ideas, and people across a connected continental network stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Europe. It's worth sitting with this seeming paradox for a moment because it will recur throughout the rest of our story. The same Mongol military campaigns capable of extraordinary, sometimes catastrophic destructiveness were simultaneously constructing, almost as a byproduct of conquest and unification, one of history's great networks of connectivity and exchange, a paradox that reflects the genuinely complicated, multidimensional nature of the empire Genghis Khan was building, one that resists easy simplification into either purely destructive conqueror or purely enlightened unifier. Genghis Khan also placed considerable value, throughout this period of consolidation, on the development of Mongol administrative capacity, a genuine limitation for a people whose traditions had, until very recently, been oral rather than written. Following the defeat of the Naiman Confederation, a captured Uyghur scribe named Tatar Tonga, who had served in the Naiman court, was brought into Mongol service, and it was through his influence that the Mongols adopted a writing system for their own language based on the Uyghur script, which itself had descended ultimately from Aramaic through a long chain of transmission across Central Asia. This adoption of writing marked a genuinely significant development, allowing for the recording of laws, the maintenance of administrative records, and eventually, generations later, the compilation of the secret history of the Mongols itself, our essential window into so much of what we've explored in this story so far. Genghis Khan, though himself likely illiterate throughout his life, according to most historical assessments, showed a consistent appreciation for the practical value of literacy and administrative sophistication, and actively recruited literate, skilled administrators from among the conquered and allied peoples he increasingly came to rule, a pattern that would become increasingly important as his empire expanded to encompass populations far more numerous and far more administratively complex than the steppe herding communities of his own origin. This willingness to draw on outside expertise, incidentally, extended in numerous directions throughout Genghis Khan's career. He is described in various sources as showing real interest in questions of governance, technology, and even philosophy and religion, seeking counsel from figures representing traditions quite different from his own steppe background. Perhaps the most famous example, which belongs somewhat later in our chronological story, but is worth mentioning here as illustrative of this broader pattern, involves his relationship with a Taoist sage named Chuji, whom Genghis Khan summoned across enormous distances for consultation on questions of longevity and the nature of a well-governed life. A summons the elderly sage remarkably actually answered, undertaking a journey of thousands of miles at an advanced age to meet with the Mongol ruler in Central Asia, an episode we will return to later in our story. Let us pause again here, before we follow Genghis Khan's armies outward from the steppe, to imagine what daily life looked like for an ordinary family within this newly unified Mongol order, because the years immediately following 1206 represented, for many steppe families, a genuinely novel experience, relative peace, relative security, and a sense of belonging to something larger and more stable than the fractured tribal world their parents and grandparents had known. Picture a family whose grandparents might have belonged to entirely different, historically rival tribes. Karait on one side, Mongol on the other, perhaps, now living within the same Arban, their children growing up together, intermarrying, their old tribal distinctions gradually softening into a broader, shared identity as simply Mongol, a category that, in a real sense, was being actively constructed and reinforced by Genghis Khan's deliberate reorganization of steppe society. Herds still needed tending, following the same seasonal rhythms that had governed steppe life for countless generations before. Children still learned to ride almost before they could walk, still practiced archery from horseback, still absorbed the practical skills of survival in this demanding environment. But now, increasingly, this same population found itself organized within a military structure that could, when the Khan called upon it, mobilize with a speed, discipline, and coordination that no steppe confederation had ever achieved before, because the very units organizing daily herding life were the same decimal units that would form the backbone of Mongol military campaigns, meaning that an enormous portion of the adult male population, already skilled in riding and archery through the ordinary demands of pastoral life, could be called to war essentially as a natural extension of their existing social and economic organization, without the kind of separate, resource-intensive military recruitment and training that settled agricultural societies typically required. This is in fact one of the crucial and often underappreciated keys to understanding how the Mongol Empire achieved what it achieved. Unlike the settled civilizations it would soon confront, civilizations that needed to pull farmers away from essential agricultural labor to serve as soldiers, equip and train them separately, and support them through complex supply chains vulnerable to disruption, the Mongols possessed, built into the very fabric of their pastoral economy, a population already trained from early childhood in precisely the skills: mounted mobility, archery, coordinated group movement across open terrain that made for devastatingly effective cavalry warfare. A Mongol warrior required comparatively little additional specialized training beyond what steppe life had already provided, and could, moreover, largely sustain himself and his mount through the herds and supply arrangements that travelled with any Mongol campaign, reducing dependence on the kind of vulnerable supply lines that so often constrained the campaigns of settled civilizations' armies. This underlying structural advantage, combined now with the unprecedented scale of unified organization Genghis Khan had achieved, the meritocratic promotion of genuinely talented commanders, and the psychological cohesion created by binding formerly rival tribes into shared units and shared loyalty to a single acknowledged ruler, meant that the newly unified Mongol Confederation possessed, by the early years of the 13th century, a genuinely unprecedented military capability, one that the wider world beyond the steppe remained almost entirely unaware of, still viewing the northern grasslands as a peripheral, fragmented region of only occasional concern. That assumption was about to be shattered, decisively and permanently. To understand why Genghis Khan's attention turned, in the years following 1206, toward the settled civilizations bordering the steppe to the south, it helps to understand something of the complicated, often tense relationship that had existed for generations between the nomadic peoples of Mongolia and their far wealthier, far more populous neighbours. China, during this period, was not a single unified empire, but was instead divided among several competing states. The Jin dynasty, founded by the Jurchen people, themselves originally a nomadic group from Manchuria, who had conquered northern China roughly a century earlier, ruled over northern China from their capital at Zhongdu, near the site of modern Beijing, presiding over a population overwhelmingly ethnically Chinese, but governed by a Jurchen ruling elite that had, over the generations since their conquest, adopted much of Chinese administrative practice and culture while retaining distinct political and military institutions. To the south, the Song dynasty, ethnically and culturally Han Chinese, ruled over a wealthier, more populous, and in many respects more culturally sophisticated realm. Having been pushed south of the Yangtze River generations earlier by the Jurchen conquest that established the Jin, and nursing its own long-standing resentments and territorial ambitions against its northern rival. And to the northwest, between the Mongol steppe and the Jin territories, lay the Western Xia, or Xixia, a smaller but militarily significant kingdom established by the Tangut people, controlling important trade routes along what would later become known as the Silk Road, and occupying a strategically crucial position that any power seeking to move between the steppe and the wealthier civilizations further south or west would need to reckon with. It was the Jin dynasty, as we've already touched on, that had for generations pursued a deliberate strategy of keeping the steppe tribes divided against each other, understanding the existential threat a unified nomadic confederation could pose to their northern frontier. Genghis Khan himself, in his younger years, had participated in campaigns undertaken partly at Jin request or in Jin interest, and the relationship between the newly emerging Mongol power and the Jin dynasty carried with it, by the early 13th century, a complicated mixture of formal deference, accumulated grievance, and, increasingly, as Mongol power grew, genuine strategic calculation about the vulnerabilities of a Jin state that, despite its wealth and sophistication, faced its own significant internal challenges, including tensions between its Jurchen ruling elite and its overwhelmingly Chinese population, and periodic internal political instability that a shrewd outside observer might recognize as exploitable weakness. Genghis Khan's first major campaign beyond the steppe, however, was directed not against the Jin, but against the smaller kingdom of Xixia, a decision that reflected careful strategic thinking. Xixia was smaller and, in principle, more vulnerable than the mighty Jin dynasty, while still offering valuable resources, control over important trade routes, and, crucially, a useful testing ground for Mongol capabilities against a settled, walled, agriculturally based civilization very different from the mobile steppe confederations Genghis Khan had spent the previous decades learning to defeat. The Xixia campaigns, which unfolded across several separate expeditions, beginning around 1205 and continuing intermittently over the following years, presented the Mongols with genuinely novel challenges. Unlike steppe warfare, which had revolved around mobile cavalry engagements across open terrain, Xixia possessed substantial fortified cities, requiring the Mongols to develop entirely new capabilities in siege warfare, a domain in which they initially had little direct experience or specialized equipment. This is worth pausing on because it illustrates something important about Genghis Khan's approach to military challenges throughout his career: a genuine, consistent willingness to learn, adapt, and incorporate expertise and technology from the peoples he encountered and conquered, rather than relying solely on the steppe warfare traditions of his own upbringing. Over the course of the Xixia campaigns and the larger conflicts that followed, the Mongols progressively developed and incorporated siege capabilities, trebuchets, battering rams, and other siege equipment, along with the specialized engineers capable of building and operating them, often recruited or conscripted from among conquered populations who possessed exactly this kind of technical expertise that the originally purely pastoral steppe warriors lacked. The Xi-Xia campaigns proved difficult and protracted, with the Mongols facing genuine setbacks alongside their eventual successes, including failed attempts to take heavily fortified cities through direct assault, and at least one significant episode in which an attempt to flood a besieged city by diverting a nearby river proved disastrously counterproductive, flooding the Mongol camp itself rather than the intended target. But across multiple campaigns and years of intermittent conflict, Mongol pressure on the Xi-Xia kingdom gradually intensified, eventually forcing the Tangut ruler to submit and accept vassal status, providing tribute, resources, and, significantly for Mongol future campaigns, auxiliary troops to be incorporated into subsequent military expeditions. With Xi-Xia subdued, at least for the time being, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the far more formidable target of the Jin dynasty itself. A campaign that would unfold across many years and represent one of the most significant and consequential military undertakings of his entire career. The war against the Jin, beginning around 1211, presented challenges of an entirely different scale than anything the Mongols had previously faced. The Jin dynasty commanded vastly greater population, wealth, and military resources than the Mongol Confederation, including a substantial standing army, an extensive network of fortified cities protected by walls that dwarfed anything the Mongols had encountered in their Xi-Xia campaigns, and defensive fortifications including sections of what we now popularly refer to collectively as the Great Wall, guarding key mountain passes along the frontier between the steppe and the North China Plain. And yet, despite these seemingly overwhelming disadvantages in raw resources, the Mongol campaign against the Jin achieved a series of remarkable successes, reflecting both the genuine tactical and organizational superiority Genghis Khan's forces had developed, and significant internal weaknesses within the Jin state itself that Mongol strategy proved adept at exploiting. The Mongols moved with a speed and coordination that Jin defenders, accustomed to the more predictable rhythms of conventional warfare between settled states, struggled to effectively counter. Mongol forces, organized in multiple coordinated columns, penetrated deep into Jin territory, defeating Jin armies in the field, besieging and capturing fortified cities using their increasingly sophisticated siege capabilities, and, in a pattern that would recur throughout the Mongol conquests to come, exploiting divisions within the conquered population itself, including tensions between the ethnically Chinese majority and their Jurchen rulers, to secure defections, local cooperation, and valuable intelligence. By 1215, Mongol forces had captured Zhongdu, the Jin capital near modern Beijing, following a lengthy siege that, according to the accounts that have survived, resulted in devastating destruction and loss of life within the city. One of many episodes across the Mongol conquests where the consequences of resistance proved, quite deliberately, catastrophic, intended in part to convey a clear and terrifying message to other cities and states that might otherwise consider resisting Mongol demands for submission. It's worth pausing here to sit honestly with the genuine human cost of these campaigns, rather than moving past it too quickly in service of narrative momentum. The sieges and conquests we're describing were not simply strategic chess moves executed on some abstract historical board. They involved, in city after city across the years and decades of Mongol expansion, immense human suffering, populations facing starvation during prolonged sieges, the deaths of soldiers and civilians alike during and after the fall of resisting cities, and the displacement of survivors absorbed, willingly or otherwise, into the expanding Mongol order. Historians continue to debate the precise scale of mortality across the Mongol conquests as a whole, with estimates varying enormously and remaining genuinely contested. But there is no serious historical debate about the fact that these campaigns produced destruction and death on an enormous scale, particularly in regions and cities that chose, or were compelled by circumstance, to resist rather than submit. This is a difficult tension to hold alongside the other threads of this story. The genuine loyalty Genghis Khan could inspire among his followers, the religious tolerance and trade protections that marked his broader governing philosophy, the meritocratic openness that allowed talented individuals from humble backgrounds to rise within his system. All of these things were true, And the immense human cost of the conquests through which this empire was built was also true. Understanding Genghis Khan honestly requires holding both of these realities together, rather than resolving the tension too neatly in either direction. Despite the capture of Zhongdu, the war against the Jin dynasty would not reach its final conclusion during Genghis Khan's own lifetime, continuing instead for several more years under his successors before the Jin state was finally completely extinguished. Genghis Khan, having secured substantial Jin submission, tribute, and territory, but with the campaign not yet fully concluded, turned his attention during the following years toward developments unfolding to the west. Developments that would lead to what many historians consider the single most consequential and transformative campaign of his entire career, the war against the Khwarezmian Empire. To understand how this conflict began, we need to step back and consider the broader Central Asian world of the early 13th century, a vast and enormously wealthy region encompassing the great trading cities of the Silk Road, cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv and Urgench, centers of extraordinary wealth, learning, and cultural sophistication that had flourished for centuries as crucial junctions in the long-distance trade connecting China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean world. By the early 13th century, much of this region had come under the control of the Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by a Shah named Ala ad-Din Muhammad, who had built, through his own recent conquests, a realm of impressive size and wealth, encompassing territory across modern-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. The Khwarezmian Shah presided over an empire of genuine sophistication and cultural achievement, home to renowned scholars, poets, and craftsmen, its great cities adorned with mosques, libraries, and bustling markets that drew merchants from across the known world. Genghis Khan, according to the surviving accounts, initially sought not conflict but trade and diplomatic relations with this wealthy western neighbor, sending an initial diplomatic mission and, subsequently, a substantial trade caravan, reportedly consisting of several hundred merchants along with valuable goods, toward Khwarezmian territory, hoping to establish the kind of mutually beneficial commercial relationship that reflected his consistent broader interest in protecting and promoting long-distance trade. What happened next would prove to be one of history's more consequential diplomatic and political miscalculations. The governor of the Khwarezmian border city of Otra, a man named Inalchuk, apparently motivated by some combination of greed for the caravan's valuable goods and suspicion that the merchants might be spies gathering intelligence for a future invasion, ordered the entire caravan seized and its members executed, an act that violated deeply held steppe and broader Eurasian conventions regarding the protection owed to merchants and diplomatic envoys. Genghis Khan, according to the accounts, responded initially not with immediate war but with a further diplomatic effort, sending envoys directly to Shah Muhammad demanding the surrender of the offending governor and appropriate restitution. The Shah's response, whether motivated by his own confidence in Khwarezmian military strength, by pressure from his governor's powerful family connections, or by simple miscalculation of the threat he now faced, was to execute at least one member of this diplomatic mission and send the others back with their beards shaved, an act of calculated, deliberate humiliation that, within the diplomatic and cultural conventions of the era, amounted to an unmistakable declaration that war, rather than negotiated settlement, was now unavoidable. It's worth pausing here to reflect on what this episode reveals about the broader dynamics that would characterize Genghis Khan's approach to expansion throughout the rest of his career, and about the profound, almost tragic mismatch in understanding that seems to have existed between the Khwarezmian court and the reality of the power now arrayed against them. From the perspective of Shah Muhammad's court, the Mongols likely appeared as they had long appeared to the settled civilizations of Eurasia, a distant, nomadic people of the northern steppes, useful perhaps as occasional mercenaries or troublesome as occasional raiders, but not a civilization capable of mounting a serious, sustained challenge to an empire of Khwarezm's wealth, sophistication, and military resources. This assumption, understandable as it may have seemed given centuries of prior history, would prove to be a catastrophic misjudgment. Genghis Khan, according to several accounts, took the destruction of his trade caravan and the humiliation of his diplomatic mission as a profound personal and political affront, reportedly retreating to a mountain to pray and seek guidance from Tengri, the sky god of Mongol tradition, before committing to the massive campaign that followed. A detail that, whatever its precise historical accuracy, reflects the broader spiritual framework within which Genghis Khan and his followers appear to have understood their conquests. Not simply as acts of worldly ambition, but as undertakings sanctioned, even mandated, by forces beyond ordinary human authority. The campaign that followed, beginning around 1219 and continuing for approximately 2 years, would prove devastating for the Khwarezmian Empire in ways that went far beyond what even a defeated state might ordinarily expect. Genghis Khan mobilized a substantial portion of his available military strength for this campaign, deploying his most trusted and capable commanders, men like Jebe and Subutai, whose names would become associated with some of the most remarkable military campaigns in the entire history of pre-modern warfare, in a coordinated, multi-pronged invasion that struck at the heart of Khwarezmian territory, with a speed and coordination that shattered any hope the Shah might have harbored of mounting effective, unified resistance. City after city fell to Mongol forces during this campaign. Otrar, whose governor's fateful decision had precipitated the entire conflict, was besieged and eventually captured. Its governor, according to tradition, executed in a manner intended to particularly emphasize the consequences of his original offense against the sanctity of diplomatic and merchant protection. Bukhara fell after Genghis Khan himself personally led forces against the city, reportedly addressing its assembled population, according to the Persian chronicler Juvaini's later account, with words framing the devastation about to unfold as a punishment sent by higher powers for the sins of their rulers. Whatever the precise historical accuracy of this particular framing, it reflects again the broader pattern of Genghis Khan understanding and presenting his conquests through a lens of cosmic sanction rather than purely worldly ambition. Samarkand, one of the great jewels of Central Asian civilization, fell after a siege that, despite the city's formidable defences and substantial garrison, proved unable to withstand the coordinated Mongol assault, and the city's population suffered accordingly, with substantial portions of its inhabitants killed, enslaved, or conscripted into Mongol service, though skilled craftsmen and artisans were, in keeping with a pattern we've already observed, frequently spared and relocated elsewhere within the growing Mongol domains, where their specialized skills could be put to productive use. Shah Muhammad himself, faced with the systematic collapse of his empire's defences and the relentless, coordinated pursuit of Mongol forces under Jebe and Subutai, a pursuit that would eventually carry these commanders on an extraordinary reconnaissance campaign around the entire Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus Mountains, and into the southern Russian steppe, encountering and defeating various regional powers along the way, in a campaign of genuinely staggering geographic scope, fled westward in increasingly desperate circumstances, eventually dying, according to most accounts, in isolation and poverty on a small island in the Caspian Sea, a stunningly diminished end for a ruler who had commanded, only a short time before, one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in the world. The Khwarezmian campaign, in its scale, its geographic reach, and its transformative consequences, represents perhaps the single most consequential turning point in the story of Genghis Khan's empire, the moment at which what had been, essentially, a regional steppe unification and border conflict with neighbouring Chinese states transformed into something of genuinely unprecedented world historical scale. An empire that now stretched, in the aftermath of this campaign, from the Pacific coast of East Asia to the borders of Europe and the Middle East, encompassing an extraordinary diversity of peoples, languages, religions, and cultural traditions under a single, still expanding political authority. The human cost of this campaign, it must be said honestly, was immense. The great cities of Central Asia, centres of extraordinary learning, art, and commerce built up over centuries, suffered destruction that, in some cases, they would take generations to recover from, if they recovered fully at all. Contemporary and near-contemporary chroniclers, particularly those writing from within the Persian and broader Islamic scholarly tradition that had flourished so extensively in these very cities before their destruction, described the Mongol conquest of Central Asia in terms of profound catastrophe, a civilizational rupture whose reverberations would be felt for generations across the Islamic world. And yet, even amid this genuine devastation, the the broader consequences of Mongol conquest and the connectivity it eventually fostered proved in certain respects remarkably generative. The very network of secure trade routes that Mongol conquest and subsequent administration established across this enormous conquered territory would, in the decades following Genghis Khan's own death, facilitate an extraordinary flourishing of long-distance exchange, goods, technologies, ideas, and even diseases moving across Eurasia with a speed and volume that would have been unimaginable in the fractured, dangerous political landscape that had preceded Mongol unification. Papermaking technology, gunpowder, printing techniques, and countless other innovations would spread westward along these Mongol-secured routes in the generations following Genghis Khan's death, while goods, artistic influences, and ideas flowed in multiple directions across a connected continental network that historians have come to recognize as one of the genuinely transformative developments of the entire medieval period. This is, again, the difficult, layered truth we must hold throughout this story. Catastrophic destruction and genuinely transformative connectivity, extraordinary violence and remarkable administrative innovation, ruthless conquest and consistent religious tolerance, all coexisting within the same historical process, inseparable from one another, refusing the kind of simple moral resolution that might make this story easier but less honest to tell. Let us pause again here, in the midst of these vast campaigns, to return once more to the human, ground-level texture of what all of this meant for ordinary people caught within its unfolding. Because it is easy, when following the broad strategic sweep of Genghis Khan's campaigns across thousands of miles of territory, to lose sight of the countless individual lives, individual families, individual small daily routines that were caught up in, disrupted by, and in many cases utterly transformed by these enormous historical events. Consider a merchant family in Samarkand in the years just before the Mongol arrival, accustomed to a prosperous, cosmopolitan urban life built around the great trading routes passing through their city, their days structured around the rhythms of the market, the arrival and departure of caravans bearing silk, spices, precious stones, and countless other goods from across the known world, their evenings perhaps spent in the courtyards of substantial homes, listening to poetry, discussing philosophy or theology in a city renowned for its scholarly and cultural achievements. For such a family, the Mongol conquest would have represented not simply a military event but a total rupture of an entire way of life, displacement, in the best case, or far worse outcomes in less fortunate circumstances, the destruction or transformation of institutions, communities, and cultural continuities that had developed across many generations. Or consider, from a very different vantage point, a craftsman, a skilled potter, perhaps, or a metalworker or a weaver, whose particular expertise in the aftermath of conquest marked him as valuable to the new Mongol order, leading to relocation, sometimes across enormous distances, to serve the needs of Mongol courts and administrative centers far from his original home. Such relocations, forced as they were, nonetheless created some of the very channels of technological and artistic exchange that would characterize the broader Mongol imperial system. Persian astronomers finding their way to Mongol courts. In China, Chinese administrative techniques and technologies spreading westward, a genuinely unprecedented mixing of skilled populations across the breadth of the Eurasian continent, driven initially by conquest and displacement, but generating, over subsequent generations, forms of cultural and technical exchange that would leave lasting marks on multiple civilizations. Or consider, finally, an ordinary Mongol warrior himself, far from the steppe of his birth, campaigning now across landscapes utterly unlike anything his upbringing had prepared him to expect. The irrigated farmland and walled cities of Central Asia, so different from the open grassland of home, encountering peoples, languages, religions, and ways of life entirely foreign to his own experience, sustained through these long campaigns by the discipline, loyalty, and organizational structures that Genghis Khan had spent decades building, fighting alongside companions drawn from across the newly unified Mongol Confederation, men who a generation earlier might have belonged to rival, even hostile tribes, now bound together by shared service to a single acknowledged Khan, and by the practical bonds of loyalty and mutual dependence that long campaigning together inevitably created. These are the countless individual threads, largely invisible in the broad historical record, that together made up the lived reality of this extraordinary period of expansion and transformation. Threads worth holding in mind even as we continue to follow the larger narrative of conquest and empire building that dominates the surviving historical sources. By the early 1220s, in the aftermath of the devastating Khwarezmian campaign, Genghis Khan was an aging man, likely in his early 60s, according to most historical reconstructions of his birth date, though as we've already noted, considerable uncertainty surrounds the precise chronology of his early life. He had built, across roughly 2 decades since the unification of the steppe tribes in 1206, an empire of genuinely unprecedented scale, stretching across an enormous portion of the Eurasian landmass, encompassing an extraordinary diversity of peoples, religions, languages, and cultural traditions. And yet, as any leader of an empire this vast must eventually confront, questions of succession and long-term governance increasingly demanded his attention during these later years. Questions that would prove, in their own way, every bit as fraught and consequential as the military campaigns that had built the empire in the first place. Genghis Khan had 4 sons by his first and most senior wife Borte, whose rescue from Merkit captivity we explored earlier in our story: Jochi, Chagatai, Ogadei, and Tolui. Each of these sons had, by this point in the story, distinguished themselves through military service and demonstrated leadership capability during the various campaigns of the preceding years, and each represented, to some degree, a distinct set of strengths, temperaments, and, as would become increasingly apparent, rivalries with his brothers. The question of Jochi's status, touched on earlier in our story, resurfaced during this period with real and lasting consequences. The uncertainty surrounding his conception, born, as we discussed, shortly after Borte's rescue from Merkit captivity, with the timing leaving genuine ambiguity about his biological parentage, appears to have remained a source of tension within the family, particularly in the relationship between Jochi and his brother Chagatai, who, according to the sources, was willing to voice this uncertainty openly and pointedly, in ways that created lasting friction between the 2 brothers and complicated the broader question of succession. This tension came to a head, according to the traditional accounts, during a family council convened to discuss the question of succession, in which Chagatai's open questioning of Jochi's legitimacy as a potential heir, a serious and painful accusation to level within a family gathering, particularly with the son's own mother, Borte, presumably present or at least aware of the discussion, created a rift serious enough that Genghis Khan himself was compelled to intervene, ultimately determining that neither Jochi nor Chagatai would inherit the position of Supreme Khan in favour of a compromise candidate, the 3rd son, Ogadei, whose more moderate temperament and evident capacity for building consensus among his brothers appears to have made him, in his father's assessment, the more suitable choice for holding together an empire that would require careful, consensus-building leadership in the generations following its founder's eventual death. This decision, while resolving the immediate family tensions sufficiently to allow the succession question to be settled before Genghis Khan's death, would nonetheless carry forward consequences across the following decades as the different territorial inheritances eventually granted to each of the 4 sons. Jochi's descendants inheriting territory in the far west that would eventually develop into the Golden Horde, ruling over much of Russia and the Eurasian steppe for centuries afterward, Chagatai's descendants inheriting Central Asian territories, Ogadei succeeding to the position of Great Khan itself, at least initially, and Tolui's line eventually producing some of the most consequential later Mongol rulers, including Kublai Khan, who would go on to complete the conquest of China and establish the Yuan dynasty, gradually evolved across the generations following Genghis Khan's death into increasingly separate and eventually competing khanates, the unified empire he had built gradually fragmenting into distinct successor states even as each continued to claim, with varying degrees of legitimacy, connection to his original founding vision. It was also during these later years, following the conclusion of the devastating Khwarezmian campaign, that the episode mentioned earlier, Genghis Khan's summons to the elderly Taoist sage Chuji, actually unfolded, offering us a genuinely fascinating and humanizing window into the concerns occupying the aging conqueror's mind during this period of his life. Chu Chuji, a respected religious teacher within the Taoist tradition, had gained something of a reputation for wisdom regarding questions of longevity and spiritual cultivation, and Genghis Khan, whether motivated by genuine spiritual curiosity, practical concern about his own advancing age and mortality, or some combination of both, sent an invitation summoning the elderly sage to travel across an enormous distance. From his home in northern China all the way to Genghis Khan's camp in Central Asia, near the Hindu Kush Mountains, for a personal consultation. Remarkably, Chu Chuji accepted this extraordinary summons, undertaking a journey that would stretch across roughly 2 years and thousands of miles, accompanied by a small group of disciples, traveling through territories only recently conquered by the very ruler who had summoned him, encountering along the way landscapes, peoples, and circumstances that his disciples would later record in a travel account that survives to this day as a genuinely valuable historical source, offering outside observation of conditions across the early Mongol Empire from the perspective of a thoughtful, literate Chinese religious traveller. When the two men finally met, according to the surviving accounts, Genghis Khan questioned the sage directly about the possibility of achieving physical immortality, or, at minimum, significantly extended longevity, through spiritual or alchemical practice. Chu Chuji's response, as recorded, was notably honest rather than flattering. He informed the Mongol ruler that no such technique for achieving literal immortality existed, but offered instead counsel emphasizing moderation, cultivation of inner tranquility, the reduction of excessive desire and worldly attachment, and, in counsel that carried particular resonance, given the enormous scale of destruction the Mongol conquests had produced, the value of reducing bloodshed and cruelty as a matter of both spiritual, cultivation and practical, this worldly wisdom about the sustainable governance of a vast and diverse empire. Genghis Khan, according to the accounts, received this counsel with apparent genuine respect, granting Chu Chi's Taoist community various privileges and exemptions across Mongol territory, and the encounter has been remembered across the centuries since as a genuinely striking episode, a moment in which the most powerful and feared military conqueror of his age sought out, and apparently genuinely valued, the counsel of a gentle religious teacher whose entire worldview and life's work stood in such stark contrast to the violence that had built the empire, now offering him such extraordinary hospitality and attention. It's worth resisting the temptation to read too much into this single episode, transforming it into a simple, tidy narrative of a hardened conqueror discovering wisdom and gentleness in his final years. Genghis Khan would go on, in the years remaining to him, to continue prosecuting military campaigns, including the final subjugation of the Xixia kingdom, whose earlier submission had apparently proven insufficiently durable, requiring renewed Mongol military attention in the very last months of his life. But the episode does offer a genuinely valuable, humanizing glimpse into the interior life of a man whose historical legacy is so overwhelmingly dominated by accounts of conquest and destruction. A reminder that even history's most consequential and formidable figures remained, underneath the scale of their achievements and their violence alike. Individual human beings, grappling in their own ways with questions of mortality, meaning, and the proper use of the extraordinary power that had come into their hands. The final years of Genghis Khan's life were dominated by a renewed campaign against the Xixia kingdom, whose ruler had, at some point following his earlier submission, apparently withdrawn cooperation and support for continued Mongol campaigns elsewhere, prompting Genghis Khan to lead what would prove to be the final military expedition of his life, aimed at bringing this recurrently troublesome vassal state under more complete and lasting Mongol control. It was during this final campaign in the year 1227 that Genghis Khan died, the precise circumstances of his death remaining, like so many details of his life, subject to some historical uncertainty and competing accounts. Some sources describe a fall from his horse during a hunting expedition, resulting in internal injuries from which he never fully recovered. Others describe illness, possibly connected to the physical toll of a lifetime of extraordinarily demanding campaigning, finally catching up with a man now likely in his mid-60s. Still other, more legendary accounts offer more dramatic explanations that most historians treat with considerable skepticism, reflecting the tendency of legend to accumulate around the deaths of history's most consequential figures. What is not in serious historical dispute is that Genghis Khan died during this final campaign against Xia, with the Tangut Kingdom's final, complete subjugation and destruction following shortly after his death, carried out, according to some accounts, in accordance with instructions he had left before dying, ordering that news of his own death be concealed until the campaign's completion to prevent Xia forces from taking heart and reversing the course of the ongoing siege upon learning that the great conqueror who had led so many campaigns against was no longer alive to see this final one through to its conclusion. His death was in keeping with steppe tradition and, likely, with deliberate strategic concern about the vulnerability of a still consolidating empire during the delicate transition to new leadership, kept secret for a period of time as his body was transported back toward Mongol homeland territory for burial, with accounts suggesting that anyone encountered along the funeral procession's route was killed to prevent word of the Khan's death from spreading prematurely. A detail that, whatever its precise historical accuracy, reflects the genuine, calculated concern that surrounded questions of succession and the potential vulnerability of the empire during any transition of supreme leadership. The location of Genghis Khan's burial remains, to this day, genuinely unknown, one of history's more remarkable unsolved mysteries, given the enormous scale of the empire and legacy this single individual left behind. Mongol tradition of the era favoured unmarked burial, deliberately concealed to prevent future desecration or disturbance, and the sources suggest elaborate measures may have been taken to ensure the burial site's location would not survive in reliable historical memory. Soldiers involved in the burial itself reportedly killed afterward to preserve the secret, horses driven repeatedly across the burial site to erase any visible trace, and possibly a small river even diverted to further obscure the location. Despite centuries of speculation, legend, and periodic archaeological expeditions seeking to locate the tomb, including various modern efforts employing satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and other contemporary technologies, the actual burial site of Genghis Khan has never been definitively located, and remains, to this day, one of history's genuinely enduring mysteries, a fitting final note of uncertainty surrounding a life so many of whose specific details remain, despite our best historical efforts, only partially and imperfectly reconstructible from the imperfect sources that have survived across the intervening 8 centuries. Let us slow down now, here at the end of this remarkable life, and simply sit for a while with what it all adds up to, not in the sense of a final verdict or judgment, which is not really what this kind of quiet historical reflection is for, but simply in the sense of taking stock, gently, of the extraordinary distance travelled between where this story began and where it now gently comes to rest. A fatherless boy abandoned by his own clan to likely death on the harsh Mongolian steppe. A captive, held in a wooden restraint, hiding submerged in a river with only his face above the waterline to escape those who wished him dead. A young husband, watching his wife carried away by raiders, forced to call upon distant allies and uncertain loyalties to win her back. A leader who lost as often as he won in the early years of his long, difficult rise, who experienced genuine catastrophic defeat, who rebuilt his fortunes more than once from circumstances that would have permanently ended the ambitions of most other men. And from all of that difficulty, from all of that hard-won, often painful experience, something genuinely unprecedented eventually emerged. The unification, for the first time in recorded history, of the fractious peoples of the Mongolian steppe under a single acknowledged authority, followed by the construction of an empire that would, within a generation of his death, stretch from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Europe, encompassing more contiguous territory than any single political entity before or since, reshaping the political, cultural, and demographic landscape of an enormous portion of the Eurasian continent in ways whose consequences continue to reverberate, in countless subtle and not-so-subtle ways, into our own contemporary world. The empire Genghis Khan built was, as we've explored throughout this story, a genuinely complicated legacy, one that resists easy simplification into either simple villainy or simple heroism. It was built through campaigns that produced immense, genuine human suffering and destruction, campaigns whose consequences the peoples and civilizations affected by them would carry forward across generations, and it was simultaneously built with genuine administrative innovation, meritocratic openness that allowed talented individuals to rise regardless of birth, consistent religious tolerance across an enormously diverse population, and the protection of trade networks that would, in the decades following his death, facilitate one of history's great periods of Eurasian connectivity and exchange. In the years and centuries that followed Genghis Khan's death, his empire continued its extraordinary expansion under his sons and grandsons, Ogedei completing the conquest of the Jin dynasty and launching devastating campaigns deep into Europe, reaching as far as Hungary and Poland before internal Mongol political considerations prompted a withdrawal that Europe, largely unaware of how close it had come to potential further Mongol advance, would remember as a providential deliverance. His grandson Kublai Khan would eventually complete the long, difficult conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China, uniting the whole of China under Mongol rule for the first time and establishing the Yuan dynasty, adopting many elements of Chinese imperial governance and culture, even while retaining distinct Mongol identity and institutions. Other grandsons would establish the Ilkhanate across Persia and the Middle East, and the Golden Horde across the Russian steppe, each of these successor khanates developing, across subsequent generations, their own distinct trajectories, gradually adopting elements of the cultures and religions of the populations they ruled over, and gradually, too, growing apart from one another and from their shared point of origin. In the vision of unification Genghis Khan had first achieved back in 1206, the genetic legacy of Genghis Khan and his immediate family, remarkably, appears to survive to the present day on a scale that reflects the sheer scope of the empire he built. Genetic studies conducted in recent decades have identified a particular Y chromosome lineage carried by a strikingly large number of men across a vast swath of territory once encompassed by the Mongol Empire, a pattern that many researchers have connected, with appropriate scientific caution about the inherent uncertainties of such historical genetic inference, to the reproductive privileges and opportunities that accompanied Genghis Khan's own position and of his numerous descendants across the generations of Mongol imperial rule that followed. And the cultural and historical memory of Genghis Khan himself has travelled an equally remarkable, equally complicated path across the centuries since his death, remembered in much of the territory he conquered, primarily through the lens of devastating conquest and destruction. A figure of enduring dread whose name became, in numerous languages across Eurasia, a byword for overwhelming catastrophic violence, and yet remembered within Mongolia itself quite differently, as the founding father of Mongol national identity and unity, a figure of profound pride and reverence, whose image today adorns Mongolia's currency, whose name graces its international airport, and whose statue, an enormous gleaming monument on horseback, rises from the steppe not far from where this story began, gazing out, as he did in life, across the vast grassland landscape that first shaped him. It's worth ending our story tonight not with a final judgment about whether Genghis Khan should be remembered as history's great villain or history's great unifier, because that question, in truth, does not really admit of a single satisfying answer, and reasonable, careful historians continue to hold genuinely different perspectives on how to weigh the different, often contradictory dimensions of his life and legacy against one another. Instead, let us end simply by returning once more to that vast quiet steppe landscape where our story began, the endless grass beneath an enormous sky, the wind carrying its long, unhurried journey across a landscape that has, across the 8 centuries since Genghis Khan's death, continued its ancient rhythms largely unchanged, herds still moving with the seasons, families still gathering in round felt tents beneath that same wide northern sky. Consider for a moment the small child born into that world in 1162, clutching a clot of blood in his tiny fist, utterly unaware of what circumstance, hardship, ambition, and a lifetime of hard, often painful choices would eventually shape him into. Consider the fatherless boy who once foraged for wild onions to keep his family alive, who once hid submerged in a river with only his face above the waterline, escaping captors who wished him dead. Consider the young husband whose wife was taken from him and who learned, through that anguish, the fragile, essential value of loyalty, freely given and painstakingly earned. And consider too the aging man who in his final years summoned a gentle Taoist sage across thousands of miles, seeking counsel not about further conquest, but about the proper cultivation of a life, about moderation, about the reduction of needless cruelty, questions that suggest, whatever else we might say about the enormous scale of destruction his campaigns produced, a genuinely human interior life, full of the same uncertainties, the same eventual confrontation with mortality, that awaits every person who has ever lived, regardless of the scale of power or consequence their particular life happened to encompass. The empire Genghis Khan built has long since dissolved, its successor states fragmenting, transforming, and eventually disappearing altogether into the broader currents of Eurasian history. The great cities his armies once conquered, and in some cases devastated, have been rebuilt many times over by generations who came long after, carrying forward their own hopes, their own daily rhythms of ordinary life, largely unburdened by the memory of catastrophe that once unfolded on the very ground beneath their homes. And the steppe itself remains, vast, quiet, largely unchanged across the intervening centuries, the wind still moving across the grass, exactly as it did on the night a small boy was born along the banks of the Onon River, in a world that could not yet imagine what he would become. Let that quiet steppe be where we leave this story tonight. Let the wind carry you gently now, away from the weight of empires and conquest, away from the long, complicated arc of one extraordinary, difficult, deeply human life, and towards something simpler and more restful. The wide, dark sky above the grass, the slow turning of stars that have watched over this landscape for far longer than any empire, any conqueror, any single human story could ever hope to outlast. Rest now. The story, like the grass beneath that enormous sky, will still be here whenever you're ready to return to it. Sleep well.